Herzlich willkommen. Manchmal verdrängen wir die Bilder von Krieg, Zerstörung, Flucht, Hunger und Elend. Und manchmal schauen wir hin und fragen, warum tun Menschen so etwas? Warum lassen wir solches Leiden zu? Für meinen heutigen Gast ist klar, auch wenn es Elend und Grausamkeit gibt, der Mensch ist im Grunde gut. Und so lautet auch der Titel seines Bestsellers, Im Grunde gut, eine neue Geschichte der Menschheit. Ob diese Deutung der Geschichte stimmt, das wollen wir heute herausfinden. Ganz herzlich willkommen, Rutger Bregman.
Thanks for having me.
Ja, Herr Bregman, sind Sie angesichts dieses brutalen Angriffskriegs in der Ukraine nicht erschüttert in Ihrem Vertrauen, dass der Mensch im Grunde gut ist?
Well, look, if you write a book about human decency, you know that you have to go on for hundreds of pages about all the atrocities that happened in human history, right? You could even say that we are one of the cruelest species in the animal kingdom, right? We do horrible things. I've never heard of a penguin that says, let's destroy another group of penguins, or a bonobo that exterminates other groups of bonobos. These are singularly human crimes. So in that sense, I mean, obviously, we're not surprised that we humans are capable of this. So in that sense, no.
Aber zugleich ist es ja dann überraschend, dass Sie an dieser These festhalten.
Yes. The reason why I wanted to write this book is that in the last couple of decades, there's really been a shift in science. So a huge amount of scientists from very diverse disciplines, anthropologists, archaeologists, sociologists, psychologists even, have moved from a quite cynical view of human nature to a more hopeful view, and have actually been arguing that we are the product of what they call survival of the friendliest. And that this friendliness is actually our superpower and the reason why we conquered the globe. Now, obviously, that also raises the question, why are we still capable of such,
also sozusagen gegen Darwin argumentiert, nicht Survival of the Fittest, nicht das Überleben der Stärksten, sondern Survival of the Friendliest. Das ist sozusagen die These, die Sie verfolgen.
Yes, I'm actually saying that survival of the fittest means survival of the friendliest. So imagine you're living in the Ice Age, a very tough environment. How are you going to survive? Well, you need friends, right? They are your insurance policy. If you were a narcissist, full of yourself, you probably wouldn't have survived for long in prehistory. So that's basically the argument that scientists are now making. And we can even see the evidence for that in our own bodies today. So humans are quite unique in some respects. We are the only animal in the whole animal kingdom with the ability to blush, right? Which is pretty fascinating, that we involuntarily can give away our feelings to other members of our species. And also our eyes are completely unique. So I can see you're looking at me right now, and you can see I'm looking at you. If you were a chimpanzee, that would have been more difficult because with all the other primates, they've got dark around their irises. They've got what they call dark sclera. So it's hard to track their gazes. But with humans, we, again, involuntarily give away our view, our sight to one another. And it really helps to establish trust. So that's essential to humanity. And I think it's, again, one of our secret superpowers that we are sort of built, we are designed by evolution, of course, to trust one another.
Und das bedingt aber auch, dass wir zusammenleben. Und das, was Sie gerade beschrieben haben, nennt man ja auch den Spiegeleffekt, Mirroring-Effekt. Und Sie haben einmal auch gefragt danach, ob eigentlich auch Putin im Grunde gut ist, dass Macht den Menschen korrumpiere und dass das Problem genau sei, wenn wir mächtig werden, steigen wir die Hierarchieleiter hoch und wir werden einsam, wir werden isoliert. Und es fehlt eigentlich dieser Austausch mit anderen, die uns spiegeln, genauso wie Sie es jetzt gerade beschrieben haben. Denken Sie wirklich, das ist der Grund, warum es bei Autokraten, sage ich jetzt beispielsweise, schwerfällt, sich vorzustellen, dass die im Grunde gut sind?
So I guess the shortest summary of the book would be most people deep down are pretty decent, but power corrupts. Right? Power is an incredibly dangerous drug. And humans have known this for a very, very long time. So if we again go back to nomadic hunter-gatherers, they knew all about the power of shame. Right? Shame was a very important tool to keep those at the top in check. It's just that today we seem to have arrived in a different kind of world where it's often not survival of the friendliest, but more survival of the shameless. And well, you can clearly see this in the case of many of the autocrats, right? Putin is a very, very clear example, just how corrupted you can become by power, how detached from the rest of humanity you can become, right? I think the essence of being human is that you are connected to other members of your species, right? Individually, we're not that impressive, but collectively, we can achieve extraordinary things. But what power does to you is that you think, you know, you can be disconnected.
Und jetzt ist sozusagen der Punkt, die Macht korrumpiert uns. Wir können vielleicht ja noch eine Stufe zurückgehen und mal sagen, was ist ganz grundsätzlich eigentlich das Menschenbild, von dem wir ausgehen. Und viele würden natürlich sagen, naja, Thomas Hobbes hatte recht, wir können hier den Leviathan nehmen, Thomas Hobbes, dieses bekannte Buch, der diese Ansicht vertreten hat. Der Mensch ist des Menschen Wolf, wir sind eigentlich böse, wir sind missgünstig, wir sind aber auch einsam und armselige Kreaturen bei Thomas Hobbes. Und sie gehen hin und sagen, nein, Thomas Hobbes hatte nicht recht. Es ist nämlich nicht so, dass der Mensch des Menschen Wolf ist, sondern es ist eigentlich viel schöner. Der Mensch ist ein Homo Papi, nicht Homo Lupus, sondern Homo Papi. Ein kleines Hündchen.
Yes.
Also ich auch, bin ich auch ein kleines Hündchen, kein Wolf?
I'm afraid you are, yes. I'm afraid we all are. So there's a really old theory, a really old idea embedded in Western culture, which some scientists call veneer theory. The notion that our civilization is just a thin layer, just a thin veneer, and that below that lies raw human nature. That supposedly deep down we're all wolves, animals, monsters, right? I've always, you know, thought we've been a bit harsh on wolves because actually wolves are pretty caring for themselves. They're really good at cooperating, but just to say something nice about the wolves. But anyway, this is a really old theory. It goes back to the ancient Greeks. It's at the heart of Orthodox Christianity, you know, St. Augustine talking about how we're all sinners. It's really central to Enlightenment philosophy. I mean, you mentioned Thomas Hobbes, one of the main Enlightenment philosophers, who had this view that back a long time ago, you know, in prehistory, we were engaging in this war of all against all, right? That was the human condition and that we had been saved from that by hierarchy, by authority, right? That we had given up our freedom, but got security in return.
Leviathan, der alles organisiert im Grunde genommen.
Exactly, exactly. Now, Hobbes is always contrasted, obviously, with the other philosopher, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, right? And he argued pretty much the opposite. He argued that actually life in the state of nature was pretty good. You know?
So, Hundewelpenhaft.
Yes, yeah.
Wir sind freundlich zueinander, wir mögen einander, wir suchen eigentlich den Altruismus, das Füreinander-Dasein und so weiter.
Yeah, he had a more optimistic view of human nature, I'd say. But his argument was also that everything had gone wrong as soon as we invented private property. You know, when the first man said, look, this piece of land here, that's mine. That's basically when everything went wrong, when we invented civilization. So Rousseau didn't see civilization as a blessing, but as a curse. Now, what's so fascinating is that for centuries, we've looked at Thomas Hobbes and said, well, he's the realist, right? He's often described as the father of realism. And Rousseau, well, he's often seen as the revolutionary romantic, right? The one with the radical, perhaps quite dangerous ideas, but not very realistic. And what's so fascinating, I think, is that if you now look at the latest evidence we have from archaeology, from anthropology, you name it, it turns out that actually Rousseau was right all along.
Sie haben ja auch mal gesagt, Sie hätten eigentlich Ihr Buch auch ganz gerne statt im Grunde gut genannt, Rousseau hatte recht. Also das ist wirklich die Theorie, die Sie favorisieren. Wäre es nicht naheliegend zu sagen, wir haben einfach beides in uns. Wir sind ein bisschen Wolf und wir sind ein bisschen Homo Papi, ein bisschen Hundewelpe. Auch daran erinnernd, dass es ja auch Studien gibt. Ich erinnere an die Bücher von Thomas Elbert und Maggie Schauer, Neuropsychologen, die von dieser appetitiven Aggression sprechen. Die sozusagen sagen, naja, wir haben alle auch immer noch diesen Jagdinstinkt in uns. Es ist nicht nur so, dass wir aggressiv sind, wenn wir angegriffen werden, sondern wir haben auch Lust zu jagen, wir haben Lust zu dominieren und auch das steckt in uns drin. Jetzt haben Sie vorher die Fassadentheorie genannt und gesagt, naja, die meisten denken, wir sind Wölfe und wir brauchen den Staat oder die Gesellschaft, um das Wolfhafte zu irgendwie kontrollieren. Aber die würden vielleicht sagen, es geht gar nicht mehr so darum zu sagen, es braucht die Fassade oder nicht, sondern wir haben einfach beides in uns drin. Es gibt schon auch diese aggressive Seite in uns.
Yes, obviously. Look, I'm not saying that we humans are angels. We're clearly not, right? We're capable of jealousy, horrific aggression, you name it. I like the German title, Im Grunde gut, because it basically says deep down we're decent, right? There's something we can build on. And so if you look at our capacity for violence, for example. A lot of people, you know, they've watched too many movies and they think that, you know, violence is very easy. You know, you just draft a soldier into a war and, you know, very quickly start shooting at the enemy. There's actually a huge amount of evidence from both history and psychology that people find it pretty difficult to be violent to one another, you know. There have been pretty extraordinary findings that the vast majority of soldiers, you know, who've just been drafted into a war. I'm not talking about professional soldiers here, but, you know, just average men who've just been drafted into a war, they don't actually manage to shoot at the enemy or find it very difficult. They have to be brainwashed first and conditioned first. The vast majority of casualties during wars come from artillery, right? Because it's psychologically much easier to push a button and kill a lot of people far away, right? This doesn't condone anything, but it does make you think, are we really so violent as we think we are? What happens to soldiers if they do actually kill during warfare? Well, often they kill something inside themselves as well, right? This happened after war in Vietnam, for example. So many soldiers came back with PTSD because apparently, you know, it's not good for us. If you distinguish it from, I don't know, eating food, we enjoy that. Having sex, we enjoy that, which makes sense because it's good for the species, right? It's good for all of us. But with violence, that's different. We kill something in ourselves as well.
Langfristig vielleicht ja, wobei diese Elbert und Schauer, die sagen auch, es kann schon zu sowas kommen wie einem Blutrausch, an einem sich ergötzen am Töten und am Morden im Krieg, oft natürlich ausgelöst durch Umstände, in denen alle dasselbe tun. Und für mich war fast am interessantesten am Buch, dass sie ganz viele sozialpsychologischen Experimente noch einmal untersuchen und Gegentheorien aufstellen und sagen, so steht das gar nicht in diesen Untersuchungen. Also solche Dinge wie das Stanford Prison Experiment oder das Milgram Experiment, ganz berühmte Experimente, die versucht haben zu zeigen, zu welch grauenhaften Taten Menschen in der Lage sind, wo sie sagen, nein, aber diese Studien geben das so gar nicht her und konnten auch gar nicht nachher noch einmal verifiziert werden.
Yes, and look, I used to believe in these studies as well, right? So the Stanford Prison Experiment is a good example. One of the most famous experiments in the history of psychology, done by Philip Zimbardo in the early 70s. And the experiment was pretty simple, you know. He had 24 young students who called themselves pacifists at the beginning of the experiment. And he divided them into two groups. 12 would be guards, 12 would be prisoners. And he put them in a fake prison in the basement of Stanford University. Now, the story that is always told about this experiment is that very quickly, after just days or even hours, the guards turned into monsters. You know, they developed this very nasty, sadistic behavior, and they really enjoyed torturing the other students. That became a super famous experiment. It ended up in all the textbooks of psychology, right? And generations of students learned about this experiment. It's actually only recently that the archives have opened up, and it turns out that the whole experiment is a hoax, right? So Zimbardo, the researcher, specifically instructed the guards to behave as nasty and sadistic as possible. And then many of them said, look, we don't want to do that because we know we'd rather just play guitar and have a good time. And then he said, no, you need to do this because I need these results for my study, right? So that we can prove how nasty people are deep down and that we need to reform the whole prison system, etc. But it's really striking that this totally shoddy experiment, you know, very, very unscientific, became one of the most famous experiments in psychology.
Nun würden wir das natürlich alle extrem gerne glauben, aber man fragt sich ja dann trotzdem, wie kann es dazu kommen, dass wir die Sklaverei kannten? 40 Millionen Menschen wurden verschleppt, versklavt. Natürlich der Holocaust als schlagendes Beispiel dafür, zu welchen grauenhaften Taten der Mensch in der Lage ist. 6 Millionen Juden planmäßig umgebracht. Sie folgen eigentlich bezüglich dieser Beispiele ein Stück weit auch Hannah Arendt, die diese Idee hatte der Banalität des Bösen, also eigentlich nicht der wirklich moralisch bösartige Mensch, wie zum Beispiel Adolf Eichmann, sondern ein Schreibtischtäter. Sie sagt ja ein Hanswurst, dieser Begriff ist höchst umstritten, philosophisch, historisch und so weiter. Aber ich frage mich, was ist eigentlich besser an dieser Beschreibung? Weil was wir dann sehen, ist einen sehr konformistischen Menschen. Und ich wünsche mir einen Menschen, der Rückgrat zeigt, der nicht einfach konformistisch macht, was die anderen tun.
Yes, and look, I completely agree with you. I think this is actually one of the problems of the puppy, is that the puppy just desperately wants to be liked, right? The puppy desperately wants to be part of a group. And this is sometimes exactly the problem. If I look at the people in history that I truly admire, right? They were more like the wolves, often, you know? They're willing to go against the group. It's one of the paradoxes in this book as well, is that you know, many of the people who really try to do things differently, they have the courage to be unfriendly sometimes, or the courage to be, you know, not liked by the rest of the group. That is a real paradox. So the way I sum it up is that I try to look at other people with more confidence and be more trusting. I think in general that's good life advice, but be more skeptical of myself.
Das ist wahrscheinlich auch ein immer sehr guter Ratschlag. Sie sind ja Historiker von Ihrem Hintergrund her, ein Bestsellerautor, ein gefragter Redner rund um die Welt. Interessant finde ich, Ihr Buch heißt Eine neue Geschichte der Menschheit. Und das ist ja nicht die erste neue Geschichte der Menschheit. Ja. Steven Pinker zum Beispiel hat auch eine neue Geschichte der Menschheit geschrieben und im Moment aktuell viel diskutiert das Buch Anfänge von Graeber und Wengrow, auch eine neue Geschichte der Menschheit. Wieso muss man denn diese Geschichte immer wieder neu erzählen?
It's a very good point. That's a brilliant book, by the way, and I think the books work well together. It's a more academic book, I think, the David Graeber and David Wengrow book. But I guess what makes history so incredibly important, or maybe even the most subversive of all the scientific disciplines, is that it shows us that things can be different. You know, they don't have to be this way. Things can radically change. It's a very simple insight, but something that we often forget. One question that, for example, really fascinates me is how will the historians of the future look back on us? For us, it's relatively easy to look back on, you know, the horrors of the slave trade that you mentioned, or, you know, the witch hunts of the past. And then we say, oh, luckily we don't do that anymore because we're so civilized today. But surely we are doing some things today that the historians of the future will be horrified by, right? And in what respects are we the criminals today? And who are the people right now who are standing on the right side of history, who are not being homo puppy, but are willing to go against the grain? You know, that's what fascinates me.
Das ist interessant, weil mich das erinnert an ein Gespräch mit Harald Welzer, einem deutschen Soziologen, mit dem ich hier auch gesprochen habe, der von dieser Liebe zum Futur 2 spricht, also zu dieser Idee, dass wir uns in die Zukunft imaginieren und von der Zukunft aus uns überlegen, wer werden wir gewesen sein und auf diese Art und Weise auch vielleicht in ein utopisches Denken reinkommen. Was mich vielleicht doch noch interessiert, wenn wir die beiden Bücher vergleichen, ohne jetzt in die Tiefe gehen zu wollen, was ich interessant finde, ist, dass Sie ja schon im Grunde genommen mit Rousseau hinter Ihnen oder auf den Schultern sagen, das eigentliche Drama der Menschheitsgeschichte begann eigentlich mit der Zivilisation. 1100 vor Christus, die Menschen werden sesshaft, sie beginnen mit dem Ackerbau, sie beginnen politische Institutionen aufzubauen, es entstehen Hierarchien und so weiter. Das ist eigentlich der Sündenfall der Menschheit. Währenddessen Wengrow und Graeber eigentlich sagen, es gab nicht diesen einen Moment. Weder ist es so, dass wir alle mal Jäger und Sammler waren, noch ist es so, dass wir alle gleichzeitig sesshaft waren, noch ist es so, dass immer Hierarchien dann hervorgingen, sondern es gibt eben nicht die eine Geschichte der Menschheit, sondern nur ganz viele Geschichten.
Well, I think where we agree is that something went terribly wrong in human history, right? There is this moment that was, you know, it was not a particular moment, like not a particular year, but sort of the period when we, you know, became more sedentary, or in the words of Graeber and Wengrow, when we got stuck in a way, you know, in a way of civilization. And that's something that really makes you think, right? For example, something like warfare. We think that that's always been with us. You know, this is what Steven Pinker, the psychologist, argues in his famous book, The Better Angels of Our Nature. I've looked at the evidence, and it turns out it's very thin, actually. There's very, very little evidence for warfare, you know, really groups going at each other in our early history. For example, if you look at cave paintings, you would suspect that, you know, some artist from prehistory, like a Picasso from back then, would have painted some kind of Guernica, you know, in a cave. But even though we've got hundreds and hundreds of cave paintings, no single depiction of warfare during this specific period. That really all originated much later when we became sedentary, just as Rousseau sort of predicted. So, of course, I agree that, you know, the pure Rousseauian vision is too simplistic, but it's a model that helps you think about the past, right? And in that sense, I think he was more right than Thomas Hobbes, much more right than we give him credit for.
Sie sagen an einer Stelle auch, im Grunde genommen kann man als Historiker die Welt verändern, sage ich jetzt mal. Dieses Buch hätte eigentlich das Zeugs dazu, wirklich eine Revolution loszutreten. Was ist denn der revolutionäre Gedanke daran, dass wir im Grunde gut sind?
Well, look, we historians can be pretty dangerous because stories are never just stories. Histories are never just histories. The stories that we tell about ourselves and to each other can become self-fulfilling prophecies. Right? What we assume in each other is what we become. For a very long time, for centuries, we've been telling ourselves, or we have been told by those at the top, that we can't trust each other, right? That human beings are fundamentally selfish. Now, that is obviously a justification of hierarchy, right? It's a justification of inequality. Because if you and I can't trust each other, then we need the kings and the queens, and the princes and the princesses, right? And the CEOs and the managers. And then if someone comes along and says, look, it's not necessary, you know, people can actually trust each other. Then the question is, well, why is that guy still in charge, right? Why do we still need him? So it's not just a philosophical debate we're having here. It's not some armchair theorizing. It has radical implications for how we organize our whole society, how we organize our schools, how we do our democracies, you know, how we organize the whole criminal justice system, you name it. It has massive ramifications.
Diese self-fulfilling prophecy und diese Vorstellung, wir erzählen einander eine neue Geschichte und vielleicht werden wir besser dadurch. Ist die auch ein bisschen in Ihnen angelegt, weil Sie der Sohn sind eines protestantischen Pfarrers?
A little bit. You know, my father is indeed a preacher. And I did think it was interesting that at the end of the book I was starting to quote from the Sermon on the Mount a lot. So yes, I mean, as a historian, this is something I've always believed. Even if you become secularized in Europe, you're still pretty Christian, right? That's easy to see if you travel a bit more, especially in Asia, just how Christian you still are. And I guess that's still something I appreciate about Orthodox Christianity, the self-doubt, right? So the concept of original sin, for example, I think it can be very poisonous when applied to others, right? When you just see the sin in others and you use that as a legitimization of hierarchy and inequality. But when you just focus on yourself, I think it can be actually quite healthy to be skeptical of yourself and to not say, I'm good the way I am. Well, maybe not. Again, if we go back to the people that I really admire in history, whether it's the Mandelas or the Martin Luther King, or I've just been writing an essay about Thomas Clarkson, you know, the main British abolitionist. These people, you know, they really were thinking about their own sinfulness all the time, and their religion played a very important role there. So even though I'm not a Christian, I do appreciate the power of belief.
Und das ist interessant, weil Sie diesen Selbstzweifel jetzt schon zum zweiten Mal betonen. Man könnte ja eigentlich sogar sagen, diese kleine Pflanze hier ist vielleicht das Bild dafür. Also wir sind im Grunde gut, aber wir müssen trotzdem auch dieses Gutsein kultivieren in uns. Es ist kein Selbstläufer. Wir sind nicht einfach gut und Ende der Durchsage, sondern wir müssen an uns arbeiten.
Exactly. It's something that needs to grow, it's something that needs to be nourished, etc.
Und dann kann man sich ja die Frage stellen, was nährt denn dieses Gutsein? Und Sie sagen ja, Sie würden gerne ein Buch schreiben mit dem Titel Rousseau hatte recht, oder das Buch könnte auch so heißen. Rousseau war ja skeptisch, dass wir in der Zivilisation gut bleiben können und gut sein können. Sie hingegen sind ja jetzt nicht bekannt als ein Staatskritiker. Sie glauben ja durchaus an die Macht des Staates, an die Qualität des Staates. Sie glauben, es ist richtig, Steuern zu bezahlen zum Beispiel. Warum braucht denn der Mensch trotzdem einen Staat, oder wie rechtfertigen Sie diesen Staat, wenn der Mensch doch an der Zivilisation eigentlich krankt?
I think the state needs to think like an anarchist. So, in many ways, this is a pretty anarchistic book, right? Anarchists believe that power corrupts and that most people deep down are pretty decent. The problem with the anarchists is that they're not very good at building institutions, right? And if you want to change the world, you got to get good at building institutions. So one of the chapters in the book is about an organization in the Netherlands, a healthcare organization called Buurtzorg. And it's obviously financed by taxes, right? It's one of the biggest healthcare organizations in the Netherlands. But then the way the organization is structured is very anarchistic. So you have teams of 10 to 12 nurses who basically govern themselves. You know, they decide for themselves which colleagues they want to hire, you know, how they do the planning for the whole week, what kind of additional education they need, etc., etc. And so if you look then at the results of this basically organization with no managers. They've basically got rid of all the managers. It's pretty shocking. You know, they deliver healthcare that is cheaper, of higher quality, with employees that are more satisfied. So they are basically an insult to management in healthcare, which we have quite a lot of in the Netherlands. Maybe that's the same here. But it's just an example of can't we do things differently? And can't we think more like the anarchist? What happens if we start trusting those around us?
Das ist interessant, weil Sie sagen im Grunde genommen, wir müssen anarchistisch denken, also nicht alles zentral sozusagen von oben sehr hierarchisch organisieren. Sie sind für flache Hierarchien zum Beispiel. Das ist etwas, was Sie beeindruckt. Aber Sie wurden ja unter anderem bekannt mit einer Rede, die viral ging, in der Sie gerade eigentlich Steuererhöhungen gefordert haben. Und man hat natürlich den Eindruck, Sie fordern auch mehr Staat, sage ich jetzt mal. Und diese Rede, die war 2019 am Weltwirtschaftsforum in Davos. Da wurden Sie eingeladen, um über dieses Buch hier zu sprechen, Utopie für Realisten. Und das war eigentlich geradezu eine Riesenschelte. Wir schauen ganz kurz einen Ausschnitt aus dieser Rede von 2019 gemeinsam an.
This is my first time at Davos, and I find it quite a bewildering experience, to be honest. I mean, 1,500 private jets have flown in here to hear Sir David Attenborough speak about, you know, how we're wrecking the planet. And I mean, I hear people talk in the language of participation and justice and equality and transparency. But then, I mean, almost no one raises the real issue of tax avoidance, right? And of the rich just not paying their fair share. I mean, it feels like I'm at a firefighters conference and no one's allowed to speak about water, right? Something needs to change here. I mean, 10 years ago, the World Economic Forum asked the question, what must industry do to prevent a broad social backlash? The answer is very simple. Just stop talking about philanthropy and start talking about taxes. This is not rocket science. I mean, we can talk for a very long time about all these stupid philanthropy schemes. We can invite Bono once more, but come on, we got to be talking about taxes. Yeah, exactly. That's it. Taxes, taxes, taxes. All the rest is bullshit, in my opinion.
Thank you. Taxes, 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 also Steuern, da brauchen wir doch einen Staat, der das eintreibt und verteilt.
Absolutely, and in many respects, I'm a pretty old-fashioned social democrat, right? If you look at the 50s and the 60s, we have much higher rates of taxations and also relatively high rates of innovation and economic growth. So we should appreciate those achievements. That's one of the arguments I make in the book Utopia for Realists, is that we are building on the achievements of those who came before us, but that we should think, what's the next step, right? So in Western Europe, we have relatively good healthcare for most of us, you know, public education. Now let's take it a step further. Why don't we eradicate poverty? Why don't we implement a universal basic income? Why don't we think about some of the other challenges of today, such as the way we treat animals, etc.? Utopia is always the next thing, right? You never really get there.
Und das sind jetzt ganz viele komplizierte Themen, über die man eigene Sendungen machen könnte. Ja, vielleicht noch einmal zurück zu den Steuern. Man hat ja in dem Bild auch gesehen, nicht alle waren begeistert von dem, was Sie erzählt haben. Es gibt natürlich viele, die sagen, naja, eine krasse Erhöhung von Steuern ist zum Beispiel innovationsfeindlich. Wir brauchen natürlich die Möglichkeit, dass Leute im Wettbewerb einander anstacheln. Und wir brauchen die Möglichkeit, dass Leute mit ihren eigenen Ideen etwas entwickeln, ohne gleich Steuern bezahlen zu müssen. Was entgegnen Sie?
So what I think is one of the greatest tragedies of our time is the extraordinary waste of talent. This is actually one of the other concepts coined by David Graeber, the anthropologist. You know, the idea of, am I allowed to say this? Bullshit jobs.
Ja, selbstverständlich. Das Buch heißt auch auf Deutsch Bullshit Jobs.
Okay, there you go. Well, that's a very academic term, obviously. And there's now been some research that shows that, what is it, around 20 or 30% of people in modern developed economies think that their own job doesn't add anything of value to society. Who are these people? Well, they have often beautiful LinkedIn resumes, right? They went to great universities, but still at the end of the day, if you give them a beer or maybe two, they'll admit to you that their job doesn't really contribute anything. So that really makes you question, who are the true wealth creators in society? What did we discover at the beginning of the pandemic? You know, governments started drawing up these lists of the so-called essential workers, right? And you look at these lists and you're like, where are the lawyers? Where are the hedge fund managers? Turns out they're not very essential after all. You know, it's the plumbers, it's the teachers, it's the nurses. They are really the strongest shoulders that carry us all. So for me, what we need here is much more than technocratic debate around the rate of taxation or something like that. We need to go much deeper and ask ourselves, where does wealth come from? You know, what is truly important here?
Diese Rede, die Sie da gehalten haben, das kostet ja wahrscheinlich einiges an Mut. Und Sie haben an verschiedenen Stellen erzählt, das war eigentlich Ihre Frau, die Sie dazu angestiftet hat.
Yes. Well, actually, if I would have known that it would have gone viral like this, I probably wouldn't have dared to. Now, I was working on im Grunde gut at my hotel room because I was very fed up with the whole conference. I thought it was very boring, to be honest. But so I was Skyping with my wife, and she said, "Come on, you've got one event tomorrow. You got to say what you really think." So yeah, we were just sort of developing the speech. Yes, I was. Yes, but she was sort of how do you say that? Sad, because I was very busy in the weeks after that, and she thought it was.
Genau, und es war nämlich damit auch nicht fertig. Also diese Rede, die hat sie natürlich berühmt gemacht, weil sie eben viral ging. Und dann ging die Geschichte ja weiter, weil sie Tucker Carlson vom rechtskonservativen Sender Fox News eingeladen hat in die USA. Da gab es ein Interview mit ihnen. Sie gerieten aneinander. Sie haben ihm unter anderem gesagt, er sei ein Millionär, der für Milliardäre arbeitet. Er wurde wütend, verlor die Kontenance, hat sie wiederum beschimpft. Und das Interview wurde nie gesendet, aber sie hatten trotzdem das Material, sie haben es im Nachhinein erhalten und über Umwege wurde dieses Material nachher publik, Riesenskandal. Das war jetzt aber nicht so wahnsinnig hundewelpenhaft freundlich ihrerseits, dass sie das publik gemacht haben.
No, but on the other hand, this is a guy that scapegoats immigrants every day, and he wanted to have some, I don't know, nice conversation with me about how I spoke truth to power at Davos and compliment me on that. And I just thought the hypocrisy was insufferable, right? So, I don't know, you don't have to be a puppy all the time. Sometimes it's really healthy to call out hypocrisy.
Dann kommt der Wolf zum Vorschein.
I guess so. I'm often struck by, you know, what happens to writers as they progress. The whole thing's like the speaking circuit, for example. People start taking ridiculous sums of money. They fly around the world, blah, blah, blah. Philosophers that talk about what money can buy or something like that, but still, I don't know. I find it a very corrupting world, and I guess I try to keep some distance.
Ich verstehe das extrem gut. Das ist etwas, was mich manchmal auch beelendet. Aber ist das nicht auch ein Phänomen? Also wie Sie es gerade gesagt haben, What Money Can't Buy, Michael Sandel zum Beispiel, war auch schon hier zu Gast. Aber Van Gogh, vorher David Graeber, Sie selbst, ganz viele andere vertreten eigentlich, was soll ich sagen, relativ sozialdemokratische Ideale. Sie werden eingeladen an alle diese Konferenzen, erhalten extreme Gehälter, die Sie zum Teil dann auch gleich wieder spenden. Aber sind das nicht alles immer nur Feigenblattveranstaltungen? Ist es nicht so, dass man sich diese Leute holt? Sie sind die Cocktailkirsche auf dem Programm. Aber wie ändert man denn wirklich etwas?
It's a really good point. I think this is one of the great problems, actually, of our time, is that we have come to believe that awareness is everything. You know, that if you collect enough clicks and likes and signatures or something like that, that's enough. You know, we've seen so many movements in the past 20 years. The Arab Spring, obviously, Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, Fridays for Future. And what they all have in common is that they came out of nowhere and were really good at raising awareness, right? But at some point, you need to go beyond that, right? If you really want to change the world, you got to get a law through Parliament, right? And that's something I think we can learn from some of the campaigners and activists from the past. It's that it just takes so much more than just getting retweeted. So, yeah, I mean, I'm always reminded during these kind of interviews of, you know, going viral at Davos, blah, blah, blah. But was it really so significant? I'm not really sure. I hope I'll achieve more in the next couple of years.
Vielleicht ist es wichtiger, more significant. Das hier, das haben Sie mal getwittert. Rupert Murdoch, der Ihr Buch liest. Also es ist natürlich ein lustiges Bild und ich verstehe auch, dass Sie es gepostet haben. Aber man denkt sich natürlich, naja, wenn die Leute das Buch wirklich lesen, in aller Ruhe auf dem Liegestuhl, vielleicht kann man ja doch, das wäre ja schön, mit Büchern die Welt verändern.
No. This guy is reading up on the enemy, right? So for him, it's strategy. And I guess we can learn a lot from that.
Sie sind nicht besonders positiv eingestellt.
No. But I mean, if we're talking about people corrupted by power, I think that Rupert Murdoch is a very, very clear example of that.
Haben Sie sich je überlegt, in die Politik einzusteigen?
Not really. I think that there are different roles to play in every movement. And people often have their favorite form of activism, right? Then they really like the people who get dragged away by the riot police, and they strongly dislike, I don't know, the people in their fancy suits on television talking about their books. I think that we all have a different role to play, and you need all of that, right? So you need the professor talking in academic jargon, and you need people like me to explain it for a bigger audience. You need people being dragged, who are being dragged away by the riot police, and you also need lobbyists in the corridors of parliament. You need all of that, and you just got to find out what you're good at, basically. And I think I would be really, really bad at being a politician.
Ich weiß es nicht. Die Frage ist ja, wenn wir noch einmal zurückgehen zu diesem Thema im Grunde gut, warum sind wir eigentlich so ich weiß nicht, fasziniert von der Idee, dass wir nicht gut sind, dass wir eigentlich böse sind. Warum interessiert uns das so? Warum hat das einen Reiz für uns? Und warum erzählen wir diese Geschichte immer wieder von Neuem? Und Sie sagen etwas Interessantes in Ihrem Buch. Sie sagen nämlich, dass es eigentlich so wirkmächtig ist, diese ganze Geschichte, weil wir immer wieder diese Bilder sehen. Und Sie erklären das am Hurricane Katrina. Wir sehen da ein paar Bilder. Die Sturmfluten setzten 2005 ja ganze Teile von New Orleans unter Wasser. Und in den Medien gab es Berichte über Plünderungen und Vergewaltigungen und so weiter. Aber wir sehen hier Bilder, die Menschen zeigen, die einander helfen und eigentlich ganz fürsorglich sind. Das heißt, im Grunde genommen sagen Sie, Schuld an diesem negativen Menschenbild und an der Faszination dafür sind eigentlich einmal mehr die Medien.
Yes, I do think that media often play a pretty harmful role in spreading this negative, cynical view of human nature. You know, I don't want to scapegoat a journalist, obviously. I think it's important to make a distinction between the news and journalism. Right? The news is the relentless reporting on things that go wrong, basically corruption, violence, terrorism, blah, 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 blah. And there's a lot of evidence from psychology in this case that people who get addicted to the news become more cynical, become more depressed. You know, they call it mean world syndrome. You just start seeing the world as a pretty nasty place. What you do need is constructive investigative journalism, right? That helps you to zoom out, to focus on the structural forces that govern our lives. It's not all good news, obviously. I mean, think about climate change or the extinction of species. But yes, there is also good news. Think about the decline in child mortality or the decline in extreme poverty, etc. I think that's what good journalists help us to do. But what in these cases of disasters pretty much always happens is that rumors start going around about people looting and plundering and blah, blah, blah. Well, we know from hundreds of sociological studies that this doesn't happen. It's called the disaster myth in science. That actually what you get in the moment of a disaster is an explosion of altruism. The vast majority of people start cooperating, working together, saving as many lives as possible.
Und das ist ja interessant, wie Sie das betonen. Und ich würde zum Beispiel völlig mit Ihnen einig gehen, dass in Nothilfeszenarien man sehr oft das sieht. Sie beschreiben auch an einer Stelle, wie ein Auto ins Wasser fällt und alle da reinspringen. Das gab es vor kurzem auch in Zürich, ein Auto, das in die Limmat gefallen ist. Ganz viele Leute haben versucht, dieses Auto rauszuziehen, zu helfen und so weiter. Das heißt, im Grunde genommen sind wir bereit zu helfen, wenn wir, ich sage jetzt mal, heroisch in die Bresche springen können, wenn wir direkt auch sehen, was zu tun ist, wenn wir direkt angesprochen sind in einer Situation. Aber meine große Sorge, auch philosophischer Natur, ist diejenige, dass die großen Katastrophen unserer Zeit ja sehr oft eigentlich eine kollektive Handlung bedürften. Also wir bräuchten kollektive Verantwortung. Und was ist dann die Rolle des guten Menschen? Also das ist das, was mich umtreibt. Klimawandel haben Sie ja schon erwähnt als Beispiel.
It's a really, really good point. So lately I've been thinking about the distinction between heroes and radicals. In the United States, you have the Carnegie Hero Fund that, for the last 100 years have been giving medals and, money to people who've done something truly heroic. 20% get it, after they've already died. So they've saved someone from, I don't know, a grizzly bear or something like that. Or done something truly heroic and endangered their own life in the process. Now, if you study these heroes, they're pretty unremarkable, actually. So psychologists have done this, and turns out, there's not really a profile. They can be men, women, rich, poor, young, old, left-wing, right-wing. You can't really say what the typical hero is like. So I define a hero as someone who does the right thing, as an ordinary person who does the right thing in an extraordinary situation. But maybe what we should be interested in is the kind of people who are extraordinary and do the right thing in an ordinary situation, right? Because
das ist interessant.
Today, there are a lot of horrible things going on. One of the main things on my mind is the way we treat animals, right? Which is catastrophic every single day. We slaughter 80 billion animals on this planet every year. And we know more and more, you know, with each passing year or week, we have more scientific insight into their sentience and their capacity to suffer. Now, it's not, you don't get a medal if you become an activist in that regard. They don't give you a lot of money, right? Often the radicals, they make us uncomfortable, right?
Das ist extrem interessant, weil Sie jetzt sagen, also der Radikale ist eigentlich der Held. Und das ist derjenige, wenn ich Sie richtig verstanden habe, der das Außerordentliche tut in ganz gewöhnlichen Umständen, eigentlich im Alltag. Würde das für Sie auch heißen, wir sind alle dazu aufgerufen, uns nach bestem Wissen und Gewissen zurückzuhalten im Konsum, im Reisen, im Fleischessen, was weiß ich immer? Oder sind Sie eher so, dass Sie sagen, nein, das bringt ja alles auch gar nichts? Weil diese Frage, glaube ich, ist so zentral für viele Menschen.
Mm-hmm. So there are hundreds and hundreds of self-help books out there that will teach you how to get rich quick or to become more mindful or that tell you you're good the way you are. If I would ever write a self-help book, it would tell you you're not good the way you are. You got to change your life, right? You got to make your life much more difficult for yourself. If your ideals do not require sacrifices, then how significant are they really? So you see, there's really a distinction here between how you look at yourself and how you look at other people. I think it's very important to assume the best in others, you know, to assume good intent, because people usually are much better than we give them credit for. Mm-hmm. But with ourselves, so I'm basically arguing for turning it all around. You know, we often look at ourselves in a pretty optimistic way and at our own intentions and are more distrustful of others. And I think we can really achieve extraordinary results if we manage to turn it around. It's very difficult.
Wieder bei der Selbstkritik, wie schon am Anfang des Gesprächs. Was ich interessant finde, also ich finde vieles interessant, aber was ich besonders interessant finde, Sie als Historiker, das ist das neue Buch von Ihnen, Wenn das Wasser kommt, zusammen mit Susanne Götze geschrieben. Auch da machen Sie ja eigentlich diese Bewegung, dass Sie sagen, lasst uns in die Geschichte blicken und lasst uns von der Geschichte aus ins Heute schauen. Weil was Sie hier tun, ist, Sie sprechen über Sturmfluten und weisen darauf hin, dass wir das alles ja schon kennen. Und wenn wir über den Klimawandel sprechen, sollten wir nicht immer über die Malediven sprechen, die allenfalls untergehen werden, sondern zum Beispiel über die Niederlande und über Deutschland.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the discussion that we often have is what is the right story to tell about climate change? And to be honest, I find that incredibly boring and misguided discussion because the problem is so big is that obviously we need thousands of stories. You know, you're probably not going to be motivated by the threat of the sea, right? The sea level rise. I personally live 3 levels below sea level, right? So for us in the Netherlands, it's about the very existence of our country. It's about the question, will my daughter and her grandchildren, will they still be able to live in this country that we call home? And then suddenly, you know, you can also connect it to our history and our heritage. You know, we in the Netherlands have been fighting against the water for the last 1,000 years, right? It's a country that is not supposed to exist. So I guess that's the argument that I'm trying to make in that book, is that people need different stories, right? And probably the story here in Switzerland is going to be different. The story in Australia is going to be different. The story in South Africa is going to be different. And that's okay. We need 1,000 stories because the threat is so big.
Und Sie erzählen hier die Geschichte der Sturmflut von 1953. Das hat mich auch erinnert an den Roman von Margaret de Moor. Die hat ein wunderbares Buch auch darüber geschrieben. Und 1953 hat ja wirklich eine riesige Flutwelle, die den Süden der Niederlande überrollt. Wir sehen hier historische Bilder aus dieser Zeit. Die Deiche hielten damals nicht. 200.000 Hektar Land standen unter Wasser. Mehr als 1.800 Menschen sind gestorben. Zehntausende wurden obdachlos. Tausende Kühe ertranken. Undenkbar, man weiß das heute bei uns zumindest, glaube ich, nicht mehr. Und Sie sagen genau an dieser Stelle, es gibt eine Form von Geschichtsblindheit. Das war alles schon einmal da und es kann wiederkommen, und zwar in einem viel größeren Ausmaß.
Absolutely, absolutely. This was one of the greatest natural disasters. in the Netherlands. But it was also a man-made disaster because there were people, and one man in particular that I write about, Johan van Veen, who was warning that this would happen. And not just once, you know, for 20 years he was saying it and basically ignored.
Nannte sich ja Herr Cassandra, glaube ich, im
Yes.
Sinne die griechische Seherin.
Exactly. But today we don't have just one Cassandra, we have 1,000 Cassandras, right? We know what's going on, and still we find it really hard to make the necessary transition. On the one hand, I'm optimistic. I mean, there has been a massive shift in the past 5 years. You got to acknowledge that. But on the other hand, it's not enough, right? And even my progressive friends, I sometimes worry if they fully realize what it means, you know, how much we need to do. I mean, people talk about mobilization, like, oh, we need to mobilize, just like during the Second World War. But that was radical. That was, you know, that was a total transformation of the whole economy. And today, still, you know, fossil fuels are everywhere. I'm wearing fossil fuels. The way I got here was through fossil fuels. I just ate fossil fuels, you know, indirectly, of course. But they're everywhere, right? Then if we are not willing to make sacrifices, if it always has to be, okay, we can make the transition, but economic growth got to continue, and I still want to go on holiday, blah, blah, blah. If we're really not willing to suffer for our ideals, then how can you be serious about calling it a mobilization, right? Mobilizations are not these happy clappy affairs where we're all like, oh, this is wonderful. No, it's tough.
Und es ist wichtig, wirklich sich vor Augen zu führen, was das im Endeffekt bedeuten könnte. Vielleicht helfen diese Bilder ja trotzdem, weil ehrlich gesagt, mich hat diese Karte hier zum Beispiel wirklich schockiert. Die findet sich auch in Ihrem Buch. Sie sagen, diese Dämme, die dann gebaut wurden, die sogenannten Delta-Werke vor den Niederlanden, die schützen gegen Hochwasser in einer Höhe von 40 Zentimetern. Man weiß aber, mit dem jetzigen Anstieg der Temperaturen werden die Fluten wahrscheinlich, also der Meeresspiegel 1 Meter steigen. Das könnte aber sehr viel weiter gehen. Wenn um 4 Grad die Erde sich erwärmt, dann sagen Sie, werden wir 2 Meter erreichen, könnte aber bis 2300 bis zu 5 bis 7 Meter steigen, der Meeresspiegel. Und dann sähen die Niederlanden so aus. Und die pink schraffierten Flächen, das sind diejenigen, die dann nicht mehr existieren. Also die Niederlande ist im Grunde genommen nicht mehr vorhanden. Auch Deutschland würde es ganz extrem treffen. Also sie würden eigentlich alle zu Flüchtlingen.
Yes. So most experts I spoke to agree that we can probably manage up until 2 to 3 meters of sea level rise. We can probably do that. It's going to be extremely expensive and very, very difficult. But after that, you know, you enter unknown territory, and at some point you got to leave, right? You got to learn German so we can do the interview properly. Maybe that would be one benefit. But yes, I mean, that is truly terrifying and shocking, right? If you're talking about, the very existence of your own country. And that's what I wanted to show in this essay, right? Climate change, for us, it's not some abstract thing, you know, something far away, like forest fires in Australia or, you know, melting glaciers in Switzerland or wherever. No, it's very real for us.
Sie sind vor kurzem Vater geworden und es gibt viele junge Intellektuelle, die mittlerweile sagen, Kinder bekommen, das geht gar nicht mehr. Zum einen, weil das ein Beitrag ist zum Klimawandel, das ist ein extremer Beitrag zum CO2-Ausstoß jeder Person, die Vater oder Mutter wird. Zum anderen aber auch, weil wir diesen jungen Menschen diese Zukunft nicht zumuten können. Was entgegnen Sie? Ist es bei Ihnen letztendlich doch die Hoffnung, die obsiegt?
Well, I think they're idiots not to have children, to be honest. If the ideal is stop having kids, then where are we going, right? And it's also the way I look at the world. Psychologists have this concept of a risk portfolio, is that you can only take so many risks in your life. And what I worry about is that young people today, they have got, you know, very risky private lives, you know, on Instagram and on Tinder and wherever, but they don't have very exciting public lives. My advice is to turn it around. So whenever young revolutionaries come up to me, I always advise them to marry young, go to church every Sunday, have kids, and then you can be as radical as you want in the rest of your life.
Was war das jetzt gerade mit dem in die Kirche gehen? Ist das ernst zu nehmen?
Well, I mean, for me it's too boring, but yes. I mean, you always have a little bit of, what's the word, right? You miss some parts of that, right? There's a lot you can learn, I think, from religion. And for me, it's not so much about the specific dogmas. It's what it does, right? Often with ideas, we focus on the particular content. Is this true? Is that true? Did Jesus die on the cross for our sins? Blah, blah, blah. Very uninteresting. I'm much more interested in what people actually do with their beliefs. You know, I've just been reading a biography of William Wilberforce, you know, the great British abolitionist. He was very, very Christian. And for him, you know, it meant that he couldn't waste a single second of his life, you know, and had to fight against slavery all the time. Well, I'm very impressed by that.
Wie teilen Sie denn persönlich Ihre Zeit ein? Also Sie haben ein Kind, Sie reisen in der Welt herum, Sie schreiben dicke Bücher.
Well, I mean, the life of a writer, if it goes well, is very unromantic. You know, it's mainly reading and researching, and then I'm working on the next project. As I said, I'm really interested right now in this notion of the right side of history. What does that mean? And what are some of the things today that should really radically change? And it's not just things like climate change and how we're wrecking the planet. It's also the massive inequality. How will the historians of the future look at that? It's the extraordinary waste of talent that we've been talking about, the way we treat animals. In many respects, you could say we're still the barbarians.
Lassen Sie mich zum Schluss auch noch einmal zurückkommen auf die Frage, wie wir den guten Menschen eigentlich jetzt situieren im Verhältnis zu den Institutionen. Weil wir ja gesagt haben, sie sind kritisch gegenüber der Zivilisation, die den Menschen verdirbt. Gleichzeitig brauchen wir die Zivilisation, wir brauchen Institutionen. Und gleichzeitig wurde jetzt auch klar, der wahre Held heute ist der Radikale, der eigentlich auch gegen die Institutionen ankämpft, ein Stück weit. Welche Institutionen brauchen wir und wie verhalten sich denn Institutionen zu individuellem Gutsein oder Guttun?
So I guess the first thing I would say here is that the task that lies ahead is to truly deepen our democracy. I mean, we have something that we call democracy today, but it really is an elective aristocracy. Right? We are allowed to choose our own aristocrats, which is better than nothing, right? It's better than having a dictatorship, obviously, much better than that. But it's still not a real, genuine democracy. A genuine democracy in the original, you know, Greek sense of the word, you know, how they practiced it in Athens, was that, you know, the civilians would be randomly selected.
Ohne Frauen, ohne Sklaven.
Yes, yes, absolutely. You're very, very right about that. But the original idea of randomly selecting people from the population to be a politician every now and then, I think that's a very powerful idea. The notion of participatory budgeting, for example, I read about that in the book as well, is truly powerful. So that's something I'm really interested in. Can we move beyond the notion of the career politician and sort of all become politicians in a way, or at least contribute to the common good, be engaged in the common good? I'm really interested in if we can develop those kind of models.
Und wenn wir uns vielleicht auch noch einmal überlegen, wie verändert sich denn eigentlich diese Welt? Es ist ja sehr klar, Sie haben diese Utopien für Realisten geschrieben, eben zum Beispiel mit der 15-Stunden-Woche, mit dem bedingungslosen Grundeinkommen. Gibt es andere Ideen, die für Sie im Moment aufziehen, wo Sie denken, da müssen wir hin? Das ist sozusagen eine Idee, von der ich glaube, über die müssten wir neu noch einmal diskutieren, weil über diese Ideen wird ja tatsächlich schon sehr viel diskutiert. Sie hat auch viele Fürsprecherinnen und Fürsprecher, zum Beispiel auch im Silicon Valley. Aber trotzdem hat man auch das Gefühl, es funktioniert nicht so richtig, es ist nicht bezahlbar. Gibt es andere Ideen, wo Sie denken, da müssen wir hin?
That's a good point. You know, when I wrote that book, that was in 2013 in the Netherlands, the notion of universal basic income was very obscure, at least in the Netherlands and in America, where I was talking about it. And now sometimes people say, oh, another basic income guy, you know, it's become very mainstream. I guess in the last couple of years, I've become a little less the positive utopian. If you think about work, for example, yes, it's wonderful to look forward to a world where we work much, much less. And I think in the end, that's the whole purpose of prosperity and innovation and growth. But if I look at where we are now, there's just so much work that needs to be done, right? The radical transition, energy transition that we're talking about, and at the same time, the extraordinary waste of human talent. So for me, many of these issues have become so much more urgent than just 5 or 10 years ago. I recently visited my old student society in the Netherlands, and I was really struck by the generational shift. It was I already feel a little bit old. So back
Sagen
then,
Sie das nicht. Ich bin viel älter.
so back then, you know, when I was a member, we had 2 vegetarians. Now it was like 15 to 20% of the society was vegetarian, and every time the society had dinner together, it was vegetarian. That was a pretty big shift. When I was a student, I didn't think about, you know, emissions of flying ever. You know, didn't give a thought to it. You know, with Ryanair, we went through whole Europe and drank beer everywhere. It's very different for a young generation as well. So there's, I think, a level of moral awareness or even moral ambition in young people today that's pretty revolutionary and very new from where we were just 10 years ago. But that's also because, you know, the challenges and the problems that we face right now have suddenly become so much more urgent.
Mhm. Sie haben mal gesagt, Sie seien kein Optimist, aber Sie seien voller Hoffnung. Und wenn ich Ihnen zuhöre, kriege ich diesen Eindruck, dass Sie sozusagen den Zustand der Welt, wie er jetzt ist, Sie nicht besonders optimistisch stimmt. Aber es bleibt immer dabei, dass Sie sagen, guckt euch die kommenden Generationen an, guckt euch an, was sich bewegen lässt, lasst uns radikal sein. Ist das dieser hoffnungsvolle Funken in Ihnen?
I think so, yes. Hope is all about the simple fact that things can be different, that they don't have to be this way. And that's also why history and hope are so connected for me. Obviously, I mean, they can radically deteriorate. If you would have told the Germans in the 1920s, you know, where they would go in the next 10 to 20 years, many wouldn't have believed it. So that's also an awareness that you need to keep with you all the time. History is not the march of progress, as, you know, some psychologists want you to believe.
Hegel hatte nicht recht.
No. Progress is, if it is there, you know, it is created and sustained by humans, right? There is the moral arc of the universe doesn't bend towards justice. The moral arc doesn't do anything. People do things, right? And so therefore, what hope does, it impels you to act.
Das nehme ich mit. Menschen verändern die Welt und die Hoffnung kann ein Motor dazu sein. Ich danke Ihnen ganz herzlich für dieses Gespräch, Rutger Bregman. Dankeschön.
Thank you.
Ja, wer weiterlesen mag, wir verlosen diese Bücher, signiert von unserem Gast. Teilnehmen können Sie auf meinem Instagram-Account oder auf unserer Sendungsseite unter der Rubrik Mehr zur Sendung. Nächste Woche spreche ich mit Katja Kuhlmann und Daniel Schreiber, die beide allein leben und damit im Trend zum Single-Haushalt liegen. Beide haben ein Buch über das Alleinleben geschrieben und sagen, allein sein zu können, ist nicht zuletzt eine philosophische Gabe. Jetzt gleich folgt der traditionelle päpstliche Segen zu Ostern, Urbi et Orbi. Eine gute und hoffnungsfrohe Zeit trotz allem. Bis bald.